Panel. So welcome back to lunch and welcome back from we're still up. Welcome back to lunch break.
We're paying attention.
Okay. So thanks for joining us again, everybody. And I just want to take a brief second to introduce Tim Sorley, who's going to be moderating the session on civil society and national security. Tim, previously to his Voices, he was the coordinator for Voices, previously to his current position, and we met him as somebody who was not only an progressive activist, but somebody who was very thoughtful about how to use media in a way to encourage progressive causes, a journalist, a great writer, a total team player, and somebody who worked with Voices during the time that we were involved in, among other things, the Dark Decade, which has been referred to now a few times, and was instrumental in helping us get the Dismantling Democracy report up and going, and is a collaborator in Montreal, so we have him with us, and I'd like to acknowledge his support again of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group on helping us with our social media campaign. So thank you.
Thanks for that very nice introduction, Joel. I appreciate that. It's great to be able to facilitate and host this panel. It's definitely great to be able to work in the idea of national security and what it means to civil society and the idea of the enabling environment for today's conference. So I work with the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. And our work is to look at the impact of national security and anti-terrorist laws in Canada on human rights and civil liberties, including on dissent and democracy. And so that's going to be kind of the theme of today's panel, is looking specifically on how national security has an impact on civil society, on ideas of dissent and democracy, and also fundamental ideas to civil society around free expression, free assembly, even freedom of movement, and so we're hoping to explore a lot of that today. I'll just do a quick introduction of the speakers on panel. So it's a great panel that's going to be able to cover a lot of different aspects, I think, of this topic, and then we'll just kind of get into the presentations. So right next to me we have Greg Healy, who is a professor emeritus of history at the University of New Brunswick, also on the Voices editorial collective. And it's lent a lot of expertise to the work that we've done on national security at Voices. And he's the author of several books, but most recently of Spying on Canadians, the RCMP Security Service, and the Origins of the Long Cold War. So he'll be lending a bit of a historical perspective to today's discussion. Next to him is Dominique Péchard. Dominique is the former president of the and he's also one of the co-chairs at ICLNG, and he'll be speaking also about some of the kind of general issues concerning national security and the right to dissent and civil society in Canada. Next to him is Brendan McPhail, who's the director of the CCL, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association's Privacy, Surveillance, and Technology Project. And she'll be speaking specifically about, maybe not just specifically, but we'll kind of be diving into the impact of surveillance and national security laws on activists, or it's on the board?
Bit of a conversation with the guys on the.
And then finally, Yavar Hamid, who is also on the Voices strategy group and on the editorial board. Yavar is a human rights lawyer based in Ottawa, and has been very active, especially since 9/11, in defending human rights in Canada, especially in Muslim and Arab communities. Has worked on various cases like the repatriation of Islam Abu Razik, the Irfan charity case around terrorist listings and concerns around that, which I think several of you are familiar with. And so he'll be speaking around those issues today. So we'll go for about 10 minutes with each person, and then we might kind of have some further follow-up questions, but we'll get to the audience pretty quickly so we can take your questions and hear your thoughts. So,
well, thank you, Tim, and it's a pleasure to be here. And maybe amazing, but I'm meeting some of my Voices colleagues for the first time after a few years of involvement, but mostly by telephone. So it's great to actually put faces to voices. So as Tim suggested, we have worked out a contribution of labor on this panel, and I'm going to talk about history. So those of you who hated history, you're about to hear some, and specifically about the history of political policing in Canada. So I'm not going to talk about more recent events. My colleagues are. So I wanted to explain at the outset how I got into studying security and intelligence, because it wasn't always my field. Not surprising for those of you of my age, I was a student in the late 1960s, and see a colleague who was as well in the back of the room, Jim Turk, and was at U of T as an undergraduate from 66 to 70. For those of you younger, that was, of course, the period of the student movement, of the anti-war movement, fighting for nuclear disarmament, and the rise of the new left in general. Part of that experience, of course, of being on the left was getting into very early paranoia about cops and political policing. And of course, it wasn't paranoia, as we now know as historians. It was all very, very real. We always had plenty of evidence from south of the border, but now we know a lot more about the RCMP security service as well. So that's a mere background, because as an apprentice historian, that wasn't my interest. I started off as a social historian, doing what was then called the new social history. And for me, that was more specifically what was then called the new labor and working class history. And my early work was on Toronto workers and the rights of labor in Ontario. But then, by the 1980s, I started working on labor radicalism in the period of the First World War and the immediate post-war period. That had always been seen, because of the events in Winnipeg, as a kind of singularly Western event related to Western labor radicalism. And the argument that I made, and I think is now the accepted position, was, of course, it was part not only of a national working class revolt, but indeed of an international working class revolt that followed the First World War, and later the war, and after the war, all over the place. General strikes in Amherst, Nova Scotia, just to choose one that nobody knows about. In doing the research on that post-war labor radicalism, I discovered in the archives that there was extensive deposit of Royal Northwest Mounted Police materials, because that agency had died and, of course, was reborn as the RCMP. But as really part of the response to the labor revolt, the RCMP always had that national security mandate. But in the First World War, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police had it. But somehow the Mounties had decided they didn't care about that material, because it wasn't really them, it was the predecessor organization. So that archival material contained extensive information on police spying on a range of activists from labor, ethnic, peace, and all aspects of left political movements. In the context of the 1970s, late 1970s, when I was doing this research, of course, there was much public discourse, both in the United States and in Canada, about the disclosures of the wrongful behaviors of the security services in both of those countries. And in the United States, there was extraordinary activity around a Senate committee called the Church Committee that exposed FBI wrongdoing late in the Hoover period. And in Canada, the similar activities of the RCMP Security Service, especially in Quebec, but not only in Quebec, in the 1970s, of course, came under the scrutiny of the MacDonald Federal Royal Commission, and in Quebec, the Provincial Cabinet Royal Commission, which actually sort of got shut down because the defense did not want Quebec pursuing too far. Okay, because they had cabinet ministers as police spots, but never mind. Well, that story better.
You digress.
But what all this public scrutiny and political oversight and exposures meant was that these issues were extremely current. And in the Canadian context, of course, it led to the wrapping up of the RCMP Security Service and the creation of a new agency called Canadian Security Intelligence Service. It took a few years, but that was the trajectory, and they, of course, got there in the early 80s. What was less well known, I think is less well known, was, of course, all of that scrutiny also led to increased demand for transparency about security and intelligence agencies. And in the United States, that led to the Freedom of Information Act, and in Canada, a little bit later, to the Access to Information and Privacy Act legislation. It also led, a few years after that, to the new National Archives Act, which actually gave, not unfettered by any stretch of the imagination, but increased power to the National Archivist to demand the transfer of records. So the creation of CSIS, the ATIP legislation, and the archives legislation really changed the rules for the historical study, or any other kind of study, of Canadian security and intelligence. CSIS now had to respond to ATIP requests, and later had to move, partially as a response of getting swamped with requests and not having the facilities to deal with it, and pressure from the archives. They later moved a significant amount of the surviving, and I emphasize surviving, Security Service historical records to what was then the National Archives, which is now Library and Archives Canada. And this allowed researchers such as myself, but also a number of colleagues, to start to uncover the real history of security intelligence in Canada, which had hitherto been limited to journalistic coverage, really, much of it hagiographic, albeit increasingly critical as that moment in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s. This eventually led, many years later, to the publication of a book called Secret Service, The History of Political Policing in Canada, From the Fenians to Fortress America, which I published with Greg Whitaker and Andy Carnegie. So let me now turn to some of the content of core studies. Right. Skipping right ahead. So I was going to explain about human intelligence and signals intelligence, but somebody else, I'm sure, will get to that. I was interested then in human intelligence, and that was the world of the Security Service and of CSIS, not the world of CNC. I was going to talk about three brief historical moments, or not moments, but three incidents, I guess. One was the Fenians, and I was going to talk about them, a mid-19th century Irish Republican revolutionary group that, of course, fought for the home rule in Ireland and the liberation of Ireland from British rule. This is in the immediate pre-Confederation period, and led to the creation of what we might describe as the first serious political policing operation that existed both in Upper Canada under a guy named McMicken and Lower Canada under a guy named Madinger. I think the key in this story is, one, that it was about the Irish, and the Irish, primarily Irish Catholics, at that point were, of course, very much the other, a kind of impoverished part of the emerging working class. It was very much a defense of the British Empire, and it also was international in its context. It was part of the imperial efforts to suppress Irish republicanism, but it also operated as though the 49th parallel wasn't there. We spied in the United States on the Fenian movement and cooperated as much with the British as we could. Second brief moment, pre-First World War, Indian nationalists operating in Canada, and you'd be familiar with the Kamagata Maroon incident, and the subsequent assassination of an imperial and Canadian police spy named William Hopkinson, who was underground but served as an immigration agent and was involved in the incident, an Indian nationalist, knock them off. Canada does have violence. But the common thread here, going very quickly, was this was about Indians, in the sense of South Asians, very much the other in racial and ethnic terms. Again, it was in defense of British imperial interests, had very little to do with anything happening in Canada, other than racism, of course, and very much, as that implies, in the pursuit of British interests. And again, very much international. Hopkinson roamed up and down the West Coast. He operated in San Francisco, where there was a strong Indian nationalist movement. The third is the bifurcation of the Cold War. The first Cold War starting right after the Bolshevik Revolution, continuing in my terms until the end of the Second World War. The Second Cold War starting in many ways with the Iron Curtain speech and with the Dissent events in Canada. This saw the transition from the Royal Aeronautic Police to the RCMP, and again, taken on a whole. What was the focus? It was anti-radical, focused especially on the Communist Party of Canada, but anybody on the left was suspect as that. And of course, the Communist Party and its what were described by them as front organizations included a wide array of ethnic groups. Again, pro-British Empire, by the second phase, pro-American Empire, or the two merge, if you will, very strongly a defense of Canadian capital, very much part of an international movement that is what I'm working on now, is the context of the Five Eyes and the equivalent of human intelligence after the Second World War. And often, as I've already said, of questionable, if not of questionable legality or blatant illegality. And I would encourage all of you to look at a historical review of September 2017 by Dennis Molinaro about an affair, the Picnic Affair, which is the highest levels of Canadian government in the early 1950s arranging to tell Canada how to put in a universal, not a universal, but a tracking system that would work at their. These archival documents are just being divulged. Dennis is doing awesome work at trying to embarrass them into releasing more. There's an immense amount of the security archive that wasn't with the Mounties or CSIS, but which is with Privy Council Office and External Affairs and National Defense. And they have not transferred any of the stuff after the early 1950s. And I will, right, just, okay, I won't close with a political statement. I was going to, but I guess it's implicit.
If you all let go back. We'll go the whole thing with the
Okay. Je vais parler en anglais, mais par la suite, il y a des questions en français. Je vais prévu que je vais parler en français également. What I'm going to address is more like the present context of what Craig has been talking about. Surveillance and interference or actions against groups and people who are deemed a threat to economic and social order is nothing new, as we have just seen. So we should not be surprised that it is continuing today. Nevertheless, the context in which these activities take place has considerably changed in the past 20 years. We can say now, I think, that we live in a surveillance society in a way that we could not have dreamed of 30 years ago. Of course, has been made possible by the technological developments. It's the dark side of internet, and the fact that everything we do now, just about everything we do and more, is stored in some form of electronic data somewhere and is available. So we have seen a rise of mass surveillance in societies, which means that now the authorities cannot just surveil the targeted individuals and groups, but surveil the entire population. And this has consequences on our basic freedom, privacy, freedom of expression and assembly, which we're talking about today. A few things need to be mentioned about this mass surveillance. First of all, it's not just the doing of the state. Previously, mass surveillance was something we saw in totalitarian states, like East Germany, and the government had to do the spying itself. like with the mics in the flower pots and have informants everywhere to gather their information. But now the big entities like Google, Facebook, in fact, practice their own mass surveillance. Although we don't describe them as surveillance organizations, they are in fact surveillance organizations. Assange has already said that Facebook was the biggest spy operation in the history of humanity. And there is a blurring of the frontier between the mass surveillance exercised by private entities for their own interest and the mass surveillance of the government. As Snowden revealed, we suspected it before, but he made it perfectly clear with data. The state surveillance agencies, like the Five Eyes, have access to this private information given to private actors like Google, Facebook, and the others. And so this presents an unprecedented threat to democracy, to our civil liberties, to privacy and the other freedoms of expression and assembly. And I want to start with privacy. Privacy is a right which is belittled in the present context. It's undervalued, and but it is fundamental. I mean, with privacy is what guarantees an individual the autonomy to participate socially. If you have somebody looking over your shoulder for everything you do, you don't have the autonomy or the freedom to participate, to express yourself, or to associate with others, to act socially. And the basic tenets of privacy are being don't mean much anymore. I don't think we can say that privacy is a respected right in Canada. That privacy relies on three basic elements: consent, single use, and minimal. Consent is that the person has to consent to the information he gives. And now we have no real choice. If you want to have a service of any kind, you don't have any choice but to deliver the information which is required. And in many cases, data is collected, and you don't really know what the data is going to be used for, because the terms of an agreement which you have when you take, for example, a credit card are unintelligible, ununderstandable for most of the population. There's also the fact that people may be willing to give information because you get benefits like fidelity cards and so on, without being aware of the consequences of getting that information. We live in a culture also that, especially among young people, values being exposing oneself, and so under the idea, if I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to fear. And so, and also, well, the single use and the minimal collection of information does not mean anything much anymore. We have in place information sharing systems, both within the private sector, but also within the state. In the case of security, which is more the state security, which is more the subject we're going to deal with, since 9/11, we've seen the establishment of a whole series of measures to share information both within government, whereas they weren't supposed to according to the privacy principle, and between governments. In C-51, we have the Security of Canada Information Sharing Act, and which remains under the C-59, which is now being in first reading. But right after 9/11, we had a Smart Border Agreement with the United States, and one of the main aspects of the Smart Border Agreement was information sharing. A few years later, we had the North American Security Perimeter, which extended again this information sharing. We have now passenger information sharing systems for flights, and in Canada we have the Canadian Police Information Center, where data is from all police forces is dumped into this data center, and not just criminal information. And the United States has access to this database. So one of the problems, of course, is that this information can be used by foreign governments against which there's little recourse. We've seen Canadian citizens sent off to torture, like We have no Canadian citizens put on a no-fly list, and the American no-fly list, you have no recourse for all practical purposes, or blocked at borders. And for example, just one example of how this works against the population in general, not just against people who are activists. A few years back, a woman in Toronto who was taking a flight for Mexico was denied the right to fly by the American authorities on the basis that she had made a suicide attempt a few years back. And the reason this came up was, well, when she made her suicide attempt, her husband panicked, called the police. So the police intervened and filed a police report, which was dumped into this database we just talked about. This database is accessible to the American authorities, who must vet everybody who comes on a plane that overflies the United States, and in agreement with the secure flight agreement we have with the United States. So the person judged that on the basis of this fact, she was not eligible to board the flight. Okay. Next, one other thing which this mass surveillance system has enabled is to proceed to establish lists of people who are deemed to be a risk on the basis of risk assessment, on the basis of this massive data, which is in fact a method of profiling. And as everyone knows, profiling is targeted on the basis of what you are, in fact, on what you seem to be, rather than what you've done. And profiling, whether human or algorithm, is biased according to the function of the parameters which you choose to incorporate. So certain groups will be biased, will be targeted by this means. So you have, as a result, loaded lists of terrorist people suspected of being a terrorist menace, terrorist watch list, and no-fly lists. So all this in the context of the erosion of fundamental principles of justice in the name of national security. We have an erosion of the presumption of innocence. We see it with these terrorist watch lists and no-fly lists. We have the use of, we have lack of due process. We have the use of evidence in court that would be use of evidence that would be inadmissible in a normal criminal court on the base in these security cases. We have secret evidence, like in the case of security certificates, the no-fly list, passport revocation. And in these cases, if you appeal, you can go to a federal court judge, but you cannot be part of the proceedings, and you have no right to know the evidence against you. The best you have is a special advocate, which is not your counsel, and it means that you have a debased access to justice in a violation of fundamental right. And of course, these exceptional powers become more and more entrenched in the criminal code through the different anti-terrorism acts, and all this leads to a chill factor. With the loss of privacy, as I said, there's loss of autonomy. People may avoid expressing themselves online or participating in public debate or doing anything they consider unwanted and non-conforming. Surveillance is a form of visual control. And I want to stress that it's not just the surveillance of the state, but the surveillance of the private corporations. If something you do may deny you access to a job later, this is also a form of social control and a form of restriction to your basic rights as a citizen. And there's a PEN America poll which showed that, which revealed that 24% of its members admitted avoiding certain topics on the phone or internet. And the last two items I want to address is, one, the question of transparency. In a democratic society, you expect the state to be transparent and citizens to be protected in their privacy right. Now we have a reversal. The citizens have to be transparent and the state is more and more opaque, and it makes it impossible to hold the state accountable for what it does. And there's also the same problem with the large corporations which hold our data. Okay? There's also on that part, they know everything about us, but we know little what we do with the data they hold on ourselves. And one of the last dangers we will have to address is the manipulation of public opinion, which the systems permit, we're starting to have analysis of what's taken place in the campaign in the United States, the last presidential campaign, where programs like produced by firms like Cambridge Analytics were used by the Republicans, for example, to target voters and to influence the vote. So you can use these systems, also this information, to have sort of like dark campaigns, which can have a serious impact on elections and democratic processes.
Okay. Sorry to rush you.
No, it's like
we'll add a lot more in the conversation after. Yeah. Brenda?
So, in my 10 minutes, I'm going to talk rapidly about the over-securitization of Dissent in relation to our current and proposed security legislation. So the former Bill C-51, and the anti-terrorism act 2015, and Bill C-59. I'm going to talk about the way we deploy those bills expand into domestic violence. So I'm very grateful to Dominique explain was it domestic violence, so I can allow you to do that. And very briefly, if I get to the end, I'm going to show you some comments from people who are active politically and who talk to us in a qualitative research project. And we tried to find out what in 2016, 2017, continues to be the lived experience of people who are trying to engage politically and being subject to state authority. Dominique provided this beautiful framing, articulate, decisive, like a friction. We know that protesters, advocates, activists are regularly developed and have been for a really long time. But the privilege of sitting next to Mary at dinner, and she was telling me that back in the day we could tell yes and the officers and protest for women's rights. So this is nothing new. But I think we can arguably worry about the fact that we are entrenching the ability to perpetuate these activities in our current and upcoming security legislation. And that information technology is probably going to get worse unless we do something about it. So this cartoon really sort of summarizes both the attitude of what seems to be an attitude in security forces, which is that we need to lock it down, zero risk tolerance. And on the other side, those are couples sitting on the bench, smiling happily in front of their TV, willing to sit in front of a microphone and exchange their freedom and privacy and their way of life for a very particular conception of safety and surveillance. So, what does the Anti-Terrorism Act say about dissent? This is the security of information, of Canada information sharing. So it's not talking about whether or not this information can be collected, which is how. It's talking about how it can be shared. It's actually codifying the ability of government to share beyond intelligence agencies and from government departments back and forth. It currently actually includes an exclusion to specify that advocacy, protest, dissent, artistic expression are not activities underlying the security of Canada, which sounds great, right? That means they don't want to share. The problem is, all of the clauses above, which are excluded then in law, and include, as Mathieu mentioned this morning, risks to accountability of Canada, which could be affected, and interference with infrastructures, both physical and virtual, which speaks up a whole bunch of different kinds of protests to the and other believe it or not, the approved version of this particular clause, because the original one that was proposed included the word lawful in front of advocacy for close to some legislative expression. And I feel that some of the people in this room are involved in the extremely contradictory of having that word removed. One of only 4 amendments to the Act to protect money and freedom. How does policy 59 change things? Our government, as we heard, has pitched C59 as fulfilling the promise to fix the problematic aspects of policy 59. The primary attempt to do that in the Information Sharing Act is by changing it in sharing disclosure. But they've also tweaked the clause really at the same time. We've added the word significant widespread to the sections about people on infrastructures. So the idea of adding a threshold, actually putting back a little bit from the original system, because it doesn't come out in a slightly different way, is helpful. But then they go on to hedge the right in a new and public way. When they say advocacy, protest, and dissent are not activities that anyone is excluded from unless they're carried out in conjunction with one of those activities. So, obviously, even with the qualifiers of significant or widespread, indigenous protest blocking access to Bitcoin or down their site to be significant. But I think even more interestingly, what it does in this little phrase from, I think, the first time in our legislation, is laying bare the assumption in a law that protest carries with it the risk of undermining the security of Canada in an extremely explicit way. So it's formalizing what used to be unspoken and assumed. C59 also opens up the door for a whole new level of multi-mass surveillance in Canada. Both by our Signals Intelligence Agency, those are our computer spies, they're called the CSE, and by CSIS, our Human Intelligence Agency. Mass surveillance, as Dominique described, is the subjection of map groups and populations to indiscriminate, untargeted monitoring. And what C59 does is it opens the door, giving intelligence agencies the legal right to collect, query, and store information about in data sets, not targeted information, just data sets of information. Now we know that this was happening outside of that statutory authority, in particular from the 2016 federal court case where CSIS was slapped down for collecting and keeping a data set of information about non-citizens and Canadians when it was no longer necessary. The problem is with C59 is the changes that have now been introduced in relation to collection and maintenance of those kind of data sets is what they did that they were told was illegal in 2016 won't be after the passage of C59, or very likely will not be. It's been months. One of the pieces of C59 that I find the most profoundly troubling is the explicit inclusion for both CSIS and CSE in slightly different ways, and with slightly different limits, of an ability to collect, query, and combine, so this is the profiling, publicly available information. And the bill defines publicly available information as information that has been published or broadcast for public consumption, is accessible to the public on the global information infrastructure or otherwise, or is available to the public by request, by subscription, or by purchase. So it's everything. It's social media, it's lists compiled by data brokers, it's potentially information released subsequent to a breach, because that becomes public once it's stuck in line. It could be gray market information that we create through budgets of pilot information that can be purchased. And for both CSE and CSIS, the use of this publicly available information is allowed to happen outside of their mandates that in most cases specify that they're not to be collecting information about Canadians. So for CSE, for example, in section 23.1 of C59, it says activities within 4 of their 5 mandates cannot be directed at Canadians. Immediately below that, section 24.1a, despite section 23, CSE may acquire, use, analyze, retain, or disclose public information. So what these clauses are doing is essentially opening the door for mass surveillance of Canadians in Canada by and then, of course, there's targeted surveillance. It was mentioned this morning that we need disruption activities and census, and we specific one and retain with also slightly stricter than 359. Facilitate this. And the concern we have in relation to targeted surveillance themselves is that those who are arguably the most engaged in the verified process, including social and political and environmental activists and groups, become more likely to attack that targeted information around the intelligence agencies. But in my last minute, I have a few statements that people need to ask and have an experience of being good, proactive, and being targeted. Good. It feels like it's a story as old as time, and yet it's worth telling again and again because it's a profound human impact. So, there are people that talk about the psychological impact, just to know that nothing revealed is private as a result of standing up to someone in their community or their society. Psychological harm is individual harm. People talk about the fact that they were afraid to put it off and do their activities because they knew they were being watched. People talked about it being a continuation of fear that they've not been left behind when they came to Canada. This speaks to Alice's point that Canada needs to serve as a model for the world. And this is a place where passion comes through. And it talks about, driving people to give up. About just being so how to betray, tired, and afraid that they no longer want to. So all of these things, all of these dimensions as a society, influences us as a democracy. And when I said this morning that it's easier to lose ground than gain it back. Our new national security legislation is helping us to continue to lose ground. So I guess my conclusion is that those of us who have big trust in these issues this legislation, this piece of legislation is going to be in debate, and many listeners can raise know the way that this was noticed. Yes,
That's really interesting. I'm sure maybe there'll be more questions about the specific research I did afterwards, and maybe we'll speak more about that.
Yeah. Can you give me some one comments, please?
Sure.
So the title of my comments, I call it Enabling Islamophobia, exploring the impact of national security practices on Muslim and Arab communities in Canada. I want to start by a definition of Islamophobia. As Tim mentioned, a lot of my experience since 2001 has been dealing with CISO surveillance and interviews with people in the Muslim and Arab communities. So I thought it would be pertinent. A definition that recently, wearing another hat on behalf of the Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association, we gave the definitions on Bill M103, or the motion M103 rather, is that Islamophobia is any individual willful act or systemic condition, I underline that constitutes or contributes to discrimination or hate against a person or group on the basis of the factual perception that they are Muslim, In other words, Islamophobia is anti-Muslim discrimination of faith. It is akin to anti-Semitism. It is akin to homophobia. I want to situate as well what I'm talking about in terms of national security practices. The operational term that I like to use, I borrow from Gary Kinsman, who writes in his pre-9/11 book for Who's National Security. National security is an ideological practice. This is important, underline ideological. We use the concept of ideology here to signify a form of social organization of knowledge that attends to the ruling and managing of people's lives, and that is not grounded in the social relations and practices that people engage in on their own. So we're really looking at a destructive state ideology that imposes a different way of interacting with inner city and intervening with the lives of people. In this case, we're talking about Muslim communities. This situates, I think, this phenomenon of Islamophobia in the context of national security practice is nothing new. I think it dovetails well with Greg's comments in the question and answer. You might get into his other incidents because the chapter of anti-Muslim rhetoric, anti-Muslim legislative discretionary practices is just a recent one in the spate of historical ones that is older in Canada as a nation. So what we find here is this manifestation of Islamophobia is part of this broader phenomenon of the global war on terror. Now, there are two important parts of attending to or addressing this problem. One is the intrinsic value. I, as a civil liberties lawyer, represent Muslim individuals, I represent Muslim organizations, Muslim charities, and so for me, it's about defending the rights of my client. In the broader scheme of things, it is about the democratic erosion of principles, because this group is being, communities are being scapegoated as a method of leveraging and continuing to shift the incursion, as was just mentioned, of anti-terror legislation, which increases, it continues to increase, despite the promises to roll it back. It increases more and more. And how is this being done? It's being done on the justification of the necessity to target certain groups. What do I mean by this? Certain salient examples. I point to the example of the BC pressure cooker case of Nuttall and Karate, one that really stands out, where, just to refresh, on July 1st, 2013, John Nuttall and Amanda Karate were arrested on Canada Day. This was very, very symbolic and deliberate, for charges relating to a deadly plot to detonate improvised explosive devices on the grounds of the BC legislature on Canada Day. This reverberated shades of the Boston bombing, which happened just months previously, but in effect it was an RCMP manufactured conspiracy. This was found to be the case by the BC Supreme Court. So in a sense, in the most deliberate and I guess extreme manifestation of how ideological practice plays out, it's actually about the manufacturing of terrorism by the state. Now that's an extreme example, but the rhetoric which it engages is that there is a certain urgency, a race against time, to find the terrorists, to go through all means that are available, and to increase the legal availability, to diminish the safeguards for civil rights and civil liberties, because this problem is so urgent. Similar, another example that I like to consider is the case of Aaron Driver, the individual who was conspiring to build an explosive device and was killed by police near his home near London, Ontario. And in that case, he was subject to the terrorism peace bond. And there's an issue in terms of both the necessity and effectiveness of that device, but it was used really by the RCMP, that the Driver case as a test case, to expand the necessity and effectively say that the peace bond doesn't go far enough, because in that case it was just sort of by coincidence and good policing that the threat was averted. But more specifically, what I want to say is that this criminalization aspect is just one aspect, sort of the thin edge of the wedge in terms of the effects which go much broader in terms of what Brenda was talking about, the chilling effect that's manifest in almost every area of life for Muslim and Arab communities, that is associations within society, movement within society, democratic participation such as philanthropy or engagement in charities, employment, personal security and safety. So I'm going to go through some of those. In terms of a very important area of focus of concern is that with respect to association. In anti-terrorism cases, whether in an immigration context or another, the case is built by police on the basis of links of association. So we see not only under C-51 and C-59, but predating that, the discretionary use of targeted surveillance and investigation, where the lines between security intelligence gathering becomes blurred and leads into policing. So we have these sort of unending security investigations, which also are spurred on by this really urgent criminal imperative, terrorism imperative, which never diminishes over time. So I say that's extremely important because the criminal law, sort of in a sense, has these reciprocal effects on various other areas of society. Another area which I would touch on, and this is important, we made these comments to Parliament on M103, is there needs to be, in terms of response, a greater awareness juridically in terms of the lived experience of Muslims, looking back, for example, at the case of RDS, in terms of the lived experience of young black men in racial profiling. Judges need to take judicial notice of a phenomenon which exists in society. This is not simply a legal problem, but it's also a problem of documenting and bringing that evidence, that information to the court so judges are aware of it. In terms of philanthropy, which I mentioned before, I act and enacted as counsel for IRFA in Canada, a Muslim charity, which was flagged essentially on the basis, ostensibly on the basis of irregularity in books and records, but this came on the heels of a conservative government motivated attack on the fact that it was giving charitable relief in the Gaza Strip and associations with terrorist links to Hamas. We're in the process, the lawyers are trying to do this. IRFA in Canada, the difficulty is that the Attorney General takes the position that funding of the delisting is against the law. So we actually have to rely on the court's challenges program for a very circuitous way, even just to defend this client. So it's a bizarre, surreal situation. In terms of immigration, the whole area of criminal law and immigration represents a form of double punishment, where, as Dominique mentioned in the case of security certificates, there's this parallel form of bifurcated trial where lawyers working on security certificates in the specialized area of national security immigration don't even have access to the evidence. And in this case, it's becoming it's necessary. What we found in C-51 was not a movement away from a process that the director of CSIS said in 2008 was a failed process, was untenable, unsustainable. It was reinforced under C-51, so this is shocking. Two other areas I'll mention. In terms of employment, CSIS plays a role in screening employees in the federal public service. The kinds of questions that are asked in that context are highly invasive. I often get consulted on those kinds of questions. There's nothing that can really be done to sort of pare back that, except for a complaint to the Security Intelligence Review Committee. We'll talk about, if we have time, the difficulties in terms of review by that committee, which is not robust at all and has a diminished funding capacity. So trying to effectively do more with less. The last thing that I'll mention is in terms of mobility internationally or traveling. I think Dominique mentioned about the no-fly list. Michael Vaughn has also referred to this from BCCLA as the slow fly list. So there's the no-fly list, which is the listing or the red flagging of individuals. But I think more significant to that is where people either maybe raise a red flag, not necessarily on the list, but are impaired in their flight. Now, I'll leave on the last on this sort of last note, and there's other things that I have to say with respect to my ideas on this, but the thrust of my comment is that the issue is not one of legislation primarily or necessarily. I think Alex, Neve mentioned this in moderating the previous session, that the building blocks are there legally, infrastructurally, they've existed, since 9/11, to some extent before 9/11. But these discretionary measures which exist within policies, already within legal frameworks, these are things that can and are being exploited for political ends. There's a history of why this is being done. But I think that having these kinds of conversations, thinking about how we want to enable and re-enable a more robust civil society will be our pushback, not only just against the letter of the law, but really fundamentally against how discretion is exercised, and really questioning radically the utility of a lot of these structures.
Thanks so much to all the panelists. I think that was a lot of really interesting information and a lot to go through. I won't ask any questions of you because we have half an hour, and there was so much there. I think that there's probably questions and discussion from the audience, so maybe I'll just open it up right away to the people who have questions. If not, I'll maybe bring it up.
So I work to get Canada like the national things, and following down the panel and make sure that the water passing.
It overlaps.
So yes, I know.
Yep.
Thank you. So increasingly what's happening in the U.S., and I think it's eventually coming to Canada, are disputes over energy infrastructure projects. And so the combination of everything you said about surveillance and what I heard this morning from Nicholas related to increased use of emergency measures, it's scary, right? In the context of Indigenous opposition, considering opposition to run through their communities and people all along. I'm hoping to get some, other than engaging in the policy discussions and trying to get legislation that is more productive and what's there. What can environmental groups, community groups, other people who are working on these kinds of issues, are anything that we can do to sort of inoculate ourselves from this, from these risks that are there? This might sound like a really simplistic, naive question, but I honestly don't know what the answers might be, and it's very difficult.
Oh, I mean, it already is happening. In Atlantic Canada, you have Labrador and New Brunswick. New Brunswick was tracking Labrador with muskrat. The police response in the Brunswick case is RCMP, with a variety of things that I didn't know existed, like Indigenous interveners and other things. So it's there. Bruce lies there for the National Reserve. He wrote some very good pieces, a series of good pieces, but there was a few points about things that what you can do, at the end of the day, we have to all keep on doing what we've always done and what our predecessors did, which is do it anyway. But there can be repercussions. Shortly, some people pay dearly. But we can't afford to have to win by kind of withdrawn and stuff that we saw on the patients apprenticeships. I think there probably are ways to, in the same way that people protected themselves against technologies that were a lot less sophisticated, they knew not to use phones and stuff like that. I think we need to come up with the technological equivalents of that. Those things do exist, which is why the debates about protecting encryption are so important. So, I mean, if you're going to plan anything online, make sure you're doing it in safe ways, which I don't really understand, frankly, but you're younger than I But I think the major point is that we need to keep on fighting the good fight.
One way to, what we have to oppose to that is public opinion and mobilization. I mean, groups, when groups can be isolated or reduced to a reduced number of individuals, there are much more easy target of repression. If you have a large mobilization, if you have public opinion, repression is harder. And that's really, they have instruments, but we have numbers, potentially. I mean, in Quebec, which is during the student spring, okay, there was a practice of kettling. Well, when there were up to a couple of 200 people, the police kettled. But when there were 5, 10, or 20,000, you can't kettle anymore. So they left the demonstration alone. So, and when you could isolate a small part of the demonstration, they kettled. So you could see how being in large numbers and mobilizing is a smart answer to the question.
A few different strategies. One, I think, across the board in any area is access to information requests. It doesn't answer your question. It's not a means of inoculating yourself, but getting some kind of transparency, even if it's after the fact, of what kind of surveillance efforts are in place. This is what happened with Project Sitka and some of those access to information requests. Another is, again, it's not inoculation, but after the fact review, research. Despite all the problems with that, at least it is a review mechanism where there can be some measure of accountability. And I think, just picking up on Monique's point, that cross sort of community interdisciplinary support is also really important. So just as, in terms of the threat levels of Indigenous activists, environmental activists, Muslim extremists are seen to be these top tiers, having solidarity information exchanges within these groups from the organizing perspective can also be part of this.
In C59, there's a phrase that really struck me that this surveillance can be undertaken for any activity that undermines the sovereignty of Canada. And practicing Indigenous law as I do, I'm sort of thinking, well, does that mean that they're going to be surveilling my office now? Because a lot of the work that we do does challenge the sovereignty of Canada in particular cases, in particular ways. And if that challenge happens to be successful, like, when do they put the cameras in? When do they take me to jail? And can I hire you?
You're on the table.
I think we should run that test.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah, what was you doing?
Thank you. There you go.
There we are.
Challenge is forward.
I think part of the answer is, as with some of the other pieces of legislation, issues of information issues haven't been worked out here in relation to facing legislation. By definition, the issues of the sovereignty.
Yes.
And the issues of this. And that's actually not something that I feel has been discussed even sort of the extensive conversations that I've had with people who have been thinking a lot about this bill and take that away and think about it more. That's really
I'm just sad I can't believe you're not already.
Well, Alan Borlaug and I had a little conversation about this many years ago when the ATIP legislation first came in. We decided that we didn't want to try and get our files because we were afraid we wouldn't have them.
Guaranteed you would have got, maybe we do and maybe we don't, but we don't have to tell you.
The problem with all this legislation, including like the example you give, is it can be used arbitrarily. Like we had the example that it's on the book, like in the Quebec 1970 crisis, people had the warning measures that company, right? And in Ontario, and then finally they put out the public works protection from the Second World War.
Yes.
So a phrase, this sort of formulation, it could be pulled out when circumstances, when you feel they need to do
Yes.
something, and then you look at the law, you pull out of the hat to exercise protection.
I have a question about national security and Bill 662. Bill 62 in Quebec is a bill that purports to establish, the law Quebec is among this, purports to establish secularism in Quebec in public service. It's what I would call the Charter of Values Light. One of the things it does is prohibit the wearing of covering of the face when seeking public services, which now includes getting on a bus. And for those of you who've gotten on a bus in Montreal in February, you know that they will be interesting screening questions about why your face is covered in that and this the Quebecers will know P6, which was the municipal regulation that prohibited face covering in protests, was ultimately, that section of it was ultimately and Norfolk, Canada was ultimately let go. So my question is, especially perhaps more for people who are familiar with Quebec constitution, how much of that debate do you see, so the protest debate, the police, the association debate, how much do you see that potentially feeding into the Bill 62 debate, or do you see it as really being limited strictly to sort of religious equality and equality debate? Just in what your thoughts on that intersection between the two.
Well, I never made personally the link between the anti-demonstration legislation which prohibited masks and 62 because they don't target at all, even though it's still a face covering, they don't target at all the same population for the same reason. Okay? Like in one case, you target them mainstream demonstrators. The other case, it's a them about to attack appeal to a sector of the population on the back of the Muslim here and so on. So I mean, it's personally, I mean, if they really try to apply Bill 62 strict, I hope it would never happen in court for obvious. I'm not a lawyer, but it's pretty obvious. And probably it won't be applied. It's just a political gesture to tender the part of the public opinion like that. But the fact is, the damage is done, whether it's applied or not. And even if a bus driver does not apply, there are people on the bus who will say, aha, you have to take it off. They will take the law in their hand. And so you can already foresee like not only the stigmatization, but possible aggression, at least verbally and possibly physically, against women where we have their birthday and pregnant on the bus. So it's very ugly.
If I can add just one thing on that, it hasn't been part of this debate because it wasn't Liberal government, but Jean-François they at one point did give a justification for banning the burqa in Quebec because saying we don't know what they can hide under there, insinuating that there could be weapons or threats. And so the Liberal government hasn't used that, but there's definitely about in some quarters and in some parts of the discussion for justifying this, there's definitely that equivalency between religious garb and terrorist threats. Right here and then.
A recurring theme in this panel, but also this morning, is that abuses are often made using measures, laws, regulations, policies that predate people committing abuses. And that laws, regulations, policies are found and exploited as not originally intended. I'm wondering if you think civil society is good enough at predicting potential abuses in policies, laws, regulations that are being introduced and being put on the books. And if not, how might we do that better? How can we, it's impossible to predict any potential abuses, but are there flags that we can look for in terms of closing those gaps that may be exploited by abusers?
Maybe we'll have the panelists first and then we'll
Yeah, my one comment on that would be that looking at just the context of C51 and the whole lead up to that review and C59 as a product, there was extensive and expansive civil society response on that, and it was just so clear to everyone from a legal perspective, constitutional perspective, across the board for civil society organizations, how fraught that legislation was, and yet C59, as Brendan mentioned, we were just tinkering with that. And so I think, in some sense, with enough of a window of retrospect, like I think civil society was ready for C51, which was a very different debate than it was for C36 in 2001. But my argument would be, even at that stage, inventing the act of terrorism was not a necessity. We had the component pieces under the law. There was a different political moment, and I think civil society didn't respond in the way that we did in 2015. So I think we have that readiness and awareness. I think we just have to have the will to use it. We did it in the right way, but politically that was rammed through. And for me, the question that sort of I pose largely is that I don't know when governments and opposition parties think that they can score points on this. The question becomes more largely about really enabling and making our civil society response more effective, because we're not getting it through the legislative process.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, to the point of C59 being different, so after C59 became the Terrorism Act 2015, CCLA and CPFE actually filed a charter challenge to the bill, and then it was put in abeyance because the environment said, oh, we're going to fix it. 3 of the 5 issues that we flagged that I think constitutional immediately before the court still exists. One of them is racial fixed, and one of them is fixed. So when you think it's tweaked, it's really just tweaked. So the fight needs to continue. And I think that all of those amazing organizations we saw in C51. And we went in 6 months. That bill passed in 6 months. When it was introduced, 82% of Canadians thought it was a good idea. By the time it passed, the first time to vote 33, it was dramatic and drastic decline. So the more members of the public heard what it was doing, the more people hated it. And we knew that the problem with C59 is it's been and look at the centerpiece of this bill is some wonderful affordability measures. Everybody said that that's what we needed, and look, here it's not shiny. So the danger with C59 is that we're not going to see the same kind of response because it's not how it is on the surface. That all these things, as you say, it's more deeper. It's the gaps are in the code to get to their lives.
That's very strictly. The point you made about C59 and the legalization of things that the federal courts have questioned is part and pattern of what happens in the other Five Eyes project as well. The New Zealand Royal Commission on some of the same kinds of issues about data collection by their equivalent of CSE that slapped their hands and said it was illegal. The national government, fortunately, is no longer in power. But the national government immediately passed legislation to rectify that issue. And if I remember correctly, it's happening in the States, we have 77 pages. So, really, I think it's important. We can't depend on court protections unless we mobilize around them and really make very clear what the threat to all is.
You mentioned a couple times, Greg, but I don't think we've ever said what the 5 I's are. Do you want to just say that very quickly? About all that you want to know stuff.
Well, the five I's, it started off as UK, USA, and then established Australia, Canada. And the time was created during the Second World War and formalized after the Second World War. It was a way of splitting up the globe. And because most of the stuff that they were intercepting it's electronic intercepts. So it was cable traffic back then, and you needed to have geographic coverage. So hence, Canada had the north, of course, New Zealand had part of the South Pacific, and America had nothing to do with that. Et cetera, et cetera. But that's the only reason why the UK and the US were sharing was because they needed the geographic part. But that then grew into this kind of larger alliance that was on the human side as well. But of course now it's not geographically based. But it's very convenient because the way it really works is historically it worked, it's no longer necessary. But historically it worked because if you couldn't surveil your own people, you could get the others to do it for you and share the information. So the Americans, the NSA was not supposed to surveil the Americans, the whole. But anyway, we could, and vice versa. But it's
Back and I think we'll go hand over to you. Go ahead, and then we'll go to the next bit.
There's a lot of data that's held by, collected by charities and nonprofits, and there's a great push by governments, all those companies, using inspectors to share data with countries down the road to understand how the get at systems level change. So we want to tackle food problems, we have to understand what instruments are actually working, and to put out into action. And there is this movement, like right now, from my perspective, they kind of lack the data policy and if you heard the person that I wanted to hear one of the pieces that has come up with but as it's still very early days, charities and nonprofits as we're trying to work through this concept of data, able to ask them to do this
You mean what you do to protect the data? What you can do to protect the data?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Spring Turkey we could talk about that too, because it's the same sort of problem which any institution may have. And in this case, he was active on that issue for the Community Association in the future, where you would keep your data in servers and which you control. Farm it out to serve the Google. So I don't know if you want to. So that's
the simple point is we came to this with Google and Microsoft, officially every university in the country to take over your email. And they do it for free to save universities lots of money. And a lot of university services were that great. But the catch was, if under the USA Patriot Act, any U.S. linked corporation for the U.S. link has an obligation to turn over records to which it has access upon the request of the security agency. And there's a debate going on now. I think the ladies and gentlemen know more about this making their decision in Ireland than on Microsoft. But my reading on the face of it is where the server is located is irrelevant. So what Google and Microsoft would tell you, well, we'll put it on a server in Canada. By reading the legislation, American legislation, doesn't say, when it doesn't make reference to the location of the server. And secondly, can you imagine Google in the face of an FBI demand saying to the FBI, well, we understand you're asking us for this, but it's in a server in Canada, the Ontario government legislation. I think it's an unlikely scenario, especially when all these requests are secret, and Google is prohibited by law to advise the person directly to the request, the fact of the request. So it's a difficult issue.
I was just going to add that a nice tie-in back to the discussion about free trade, which is one of the demands the Americans have been making in all the free trade negotiations, is to prevent nation states from having legal things to do exactly that, to protect data. They want data to be free, international.
Some of you may know this more. I think the BC government has legislation with regard to school records or whatever they have to be kept again. I think that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Under that.
Yeah, BC and Nova Scotia both have data geolocation laws where I think it's more expensive in BC. It's almost any public provincial funded service. So universities, hospitals, elementary schools. So it's more expensive. I think Nova Scotia is maybe a bit more restricted, but those NAFTA gets rid of, basically gets rid of this idea of being able to protect, have a protection on data being stored, locally. Those laws would essentially be run out or end in conflict with NAFTA.
Well, one thing, just because there was an institution in Quebec treating people who had dependency, and they didn't want to give over their records to the Quebec government. And they said, well, finally the government threatened them sufficiently that they did, but the idea, they said, was, well, sure, we agree that you can evaluate the program, but you don't need nominal information for that. So one way, if you want to share data to see how programs work and so on, well, you could have data which reflects how the program works as efficacy, but not have nominal information, because that's what you want to protect.
Yeah, I would just second that. The two sort of general points in relation to anybody's data, but particularly nonprofit charities, I think, are take privacy seriously from the outset, and don't drink the Kool-Aid about the necessity for extensive, overly extensive sharing. Take a look at it from, through a lens, a privacy lens, of proportionality and necessity, rather than just there's a lot of rhetoric, particularly in relation to data analysis, that more is better and we must have this in order to do evaluation. I think we can interrogate that assumption. There's not a lot of empirical evidence that says that that's working super well. And certainly, I don't think we're going to see that super well across the board in every context that we can imagine. So I think we're just really taking a hard and critical look at what the necessity is, what the benefit we're looking for from the risks are, before we just engage in wholesale. There, have the data if you want it and give us more. That's fundamentally flawed.
Okay, Tim, I'm not sure if you know more about it from a business perspective, but my understanding from hearing what the law speak on this is that there are no safeguards as far as you're talking about like phenomenal personal information. There may be safeguards and one could argue that, but for big data and other forms of information, there aren't any safeguards.
In what sense? In the access in the United States, or just
for nothing
well, there's privacy legislation. There is, but definitely under C51 and C59, they've definitely brought in all kinds of clauses that undermine the protection and what's considered data that security agencies can collect and what they're permitted from collecting. That case around CSIS collecting personal information, and as we said before, C59 is essentially looking to utilize that after the fact. So it raises a lot of questions, and once it's in that system, then it can be more easily shared with the United States and other countries as well. This particular issue has brought up a lot of questions. We have about 3 minutes left, but Kira and Jim and Mercedes all had their hands up, so maybe we'll take all 3 quickly, and then we'll let Mercedes ask the last question.
I just like to comment, which is that in my work, we have a technology, technology, and it's a big question in terms of like client relationship management systems that people are installing to track data on their service users and measure impact. One of the ways that we've seen nonprofits be most clear to understanding about this question is actually to not build technology. So they won't have any record code that actually people can use at all to even if it was or both the data would be attached to the place rather than trying to then come up with some complicated policy that is unclear about personalized about what you would do in the case of that.
It's not a matter we have not discussed here, but we talked about concern about state access to the agency access to our data. The other concern we put in on Google, that's Google's access. The private sector has far more pervasive data on everyone in this room than CSIS does. If any of you have Bell Canada, if you're walking by, I was working on selling a product to merchants. But when you're walking down the street, your phone, and you pass a store, an ad will pop up to that store on your cell phone. So all of charitable organizations, others that use Google Docs, make a big mistake. And how the best we can do with some measure of security and accountability is to be able to do corporations at least minimize the possibility that our security agencies could access. We are relatively more protections of that Canadian agencies where we know that it will be worse in time through 59.
Yes, guys?
Je voulais amener un autre lieu aussi de cueillette d'informations. On parle beaucoup d'informations qui viennent dans le pays par la police, la sécurité nationale, mais les informations effectives qui sont pour des fins administratives. Au niveau des bailleurs de fonds, dans les fonds d'État, des formulaires et des informations qui sont retenues dans exponentielle et il faut se poser la question qu'est-ce qui est fait des informations qui sont retenues? Elles sont retenues pour un objet, pas pour rien. Et c'est intéressant de voir comment formuler l'argumentaire pour lié à la sécurité, lié aux enjeux de sécurité, versus aussi la collection de données administratives. De juste développer en une nouvelle base de données d'informations de qui fait quoi auprès de qui. Il faut se demander aussi à qui ça peut servir. Pour moi, un des éléments, juste pour continuer de se faire un peu tard, au Québec, il y a du financement d'État avec une réduction de compte. Selon les ministères, les demandes, les exigences vers les ministères, heureusement pas à la santé et aux services sociaux, mais dans d'autres ministères, qui demandent des groupes de fournir leur plan d'action d'avance. Pas supposé être pour nous empêcher. On peut faire, mais quand ils ont l'information.
I guess, so maybe one day has a quick response for what that says.
One thing that I might add, maybe it would be quick for when we were talking about metadata or machine code that's not personal information, like personal information is protected by privacy legislation, but computer generated code actually sort of along the lines of what Jim was saying. That's where you can pour like all sorts of things. That's the thing that's not the other way around. That's very, very serious and it's happening.
And maybe just one thing on what you asked us today is that question of information sharing. So it applies at federal, but we don't know how it interacts with provincial. And so there is that question of any information that's collected by provincial agency that could be construed as undermining the sovereignty or different threats to Canada could in theory then be shared with RCMP with CSIS through disclosure. And so there is that question of information that's covered by any Canadian agency, and we assume that the provincial agencies on whom that could then be forwarded or requested from those three agencies. So leave on a happy note like that. Thank you so much. People are interested in following up on C59. I know that you requested CCLA and the on our websites and in our campaigns for the next while. We'll be posting a lot of information and looking for public engagement and also looking for groups that are interested in being involved in campaigns. And so please don't hesitate to be in touch or to follow up. Thanks so much, and thanks again for coming.
And we're going to have a 10-minute break, so please be back in here.